Thank you.
Bear with me, it's still loading.
Okay, good afternoon, Acting Mayor, members of council. We are now live streaming and you can begin the meeting, Mr. Acting Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Okay, so we'll call this special council meeting for education and training meeting to order. I'll just read our notice here. Due to the efforts to contain the spread of COVID-19 and to protect all individuals, city facilities will not be open to the public to attend council and committee meetings until further notice. So this Zoom meeting is called to order, and I need a mover and a seconder to adopt the agenda. And I have to flip back to see who's willing to do that. Bear with me here. I'm trying to, okay, thank you. Councillor Syllabus, Councillor Barros, all in favor? Okay, any opposed? So that carries. Moving back through the agenda. Got to figure out a way to get the agenda and the committee members in the same screen. So are there any disclosures of pecuniary interest? Please state the general nature thereof. I see none. We'll move forward. Sorry, council members. Agenda keeps leaving my screen. So our first item of scheduled business is 3.1, education and training meeting with respect to the 2021 draft development charges. And we've got a presentation from our treasurer, David Dexter. Go ahead, David.
Thank you, sir. Here today, as we in 2021, we will be updating our citywide development charges for the various legislative changes that have taken place in that sphere, as well as we are updating two area-specific development charges as they expire in early July. We put together draft material that we presented to the development community this morning. And here we are this afternoon to present to council the draft material and to be open for discussion on the material. I introduce those who haven't met, Gary Scanlon from Watson and Associates. He's here today. I don't think his assistant Nancy Neal is, but Gary's here and he'll be making presentation. He helped us on our citywide charge, and our staff contingent, Gigi Lee, our manager of fiscal planning and strategy, was a prime driver of the project internally and also doing the area specific charges. Next slide, please. So we're going to go through a brief overview, which is going to provide a re-education of what development charges are and for. We're going to describe the stage approach, which we plan to update our DCs, both at this update in 2021 and in a more embracing and detailed update as part through 22 and into 23. Gary will be presenting the DC development charges overview and legislative changes. All the service updates and new ones created, and the draft citywide charges that reflect the legislative changes that we're bringing forward into the citywide charge. And then I'll take the microphone back and I'll talk about some bylaw and policy updates, the draft area specific development charge updates, and there's two of them. And then we open up for discussion. Next slide, please. So a couple slides here as a brief education. Development charges are collected to ensure that we have sufficient funds for new infrastructure that service new communities that come through the development process, and that they're paid for by development. Richmond has two types of charges, a citywide and area specific charge. And my next slide will break that down a little further. And we're legislatively required to update these bylaws at least once every 5 years. Next slide, please. So citywide charge are for services that are eligible services, I should say, that provided to the city that benefit all residents, no matter where they're located. And these things include hard services, such as citywide engineering, public works components, fire protection, and then soft services, such as outdoor and indoor recreation and library services. The area-specific type charges that we have are purely for hard services that benefit specific blocks only in the community. The hard infrastructure is like collector and local roads, water mains, sanitary sewer mains, stormwater management infrastructure, sidewalks. We have 8 of these in the city still going. Next slide. So as I mentioned, a two-stage approach. This first update is largely to ensure we don't let the 2 area specifics expire. That are 2 of them are along the 404 corridor. And the other update is on the citywide charge, primarily to update for the changes in legislation, Bills 108 and Bills 197. The second stage is going to be more involved, and it's going to embrace the region's growth plan update. They're currently in that process right now, updating that. And we want to make sure that our growth forecasts reflect what they have included in their growth plans. We want to incorporate various updates to plans and master plans that's currently going on in the city. The official plan is being updated, and that's the most important plan that will inform some of the other plans like the Transportation Master Plan, the Urban Master Environmental Servicing Plan, Parks Plan, Recreation and Culture Plans. And then at the end of all these updates, we then reflected in the development charge update and ensure we collect appropriate amount of funds that meet the growth and capital needs of these plans. And then another important thing that we want to ensure is in that second prong update is that we reflect the recommendations and the results of the city's capital sustainability review. If you remember, we had about 6 meetings with members of council through 2019 and 2020, reviewing all asset areas and how we want to go forward with those asset areas in the city. Next slide, please. So just at the stage 1, and amending the citywide charge based on legislative changes, and Gary's going to go through these in a lot more detail. But basically, we are adding back the mandatory 10% deduction for the soft services, that's indoor, outdoor, recreation, and library, that were previously excluded. That's to the benefit of the municipality. We want to include provisions in the bylaws as a result of the changes from Bills 108 and 197. As I mentioned, Gary will go through the details of those. And include the new classification for growth studies as a separate class of service. We want to reflect that as well. And as I mentioned, we're going to update 2 area-specific bylaws at Bayview Northeast and the Headford, excluding storm area specifics. Those both expire in early July. These are 2 areas along the 404 corridor that are largely for employment purposes. So, Mr. Clerk, I'm going to turn it over to Gary now, and he's going to go through the number of the next slides.
Thanks, Dave. Pleasure to be here before council. So we put together some slides as David's introduced. If we go to the next slide, just the things I wanted to touch on. Oh, we'll go one more. Excuse me. There we go. So the key thing I wanted to go through was there's been changes in the legislation over the last 2 years. You may recall the province came out with Bill 108, and that introduced changes to, I think, something like 16 pieces of legislation, and the development charges was one of the key pieces of legislation. So that actually evolved through four bills in total. So I'll kind of give you a recap of what each of those bills did and where we've finally ended up. And then we'll just talk about how we're making the calculation adjustments and what that'll do to the overall charge for the city. Next slide, please. And again. So Very quickly, development charges, recover growth-related infrastructure, as David was indicating. The Act actually sets up and divides costs into two different categories. One, which is called a local service, and those are what the developers pay for 100% as part of their development. So let's say within a subdivision, internal roads and water mains and sewers and street lights, those are 100% the developer's costs. It's the broader cost that we include into the development charge calculations, either the area specific or the city-wide. You can see on the bottom, all those little round blobs are basically a summary of the history of development charges. And the starting point on the left-hand side, you can see that they were introduced about 65 years ago. And they were put in under the Planning Act, and you could impose the charge when you created a new lot. So if you've ever heard the terminology, a lot levy, it's the development charge, but before we actually had a Development Charges Act. And it's the second round bubble there that identifies that the first act came in 1989. And then in 1997, there was a major overhaul. And for many years, we were dealing with the 1997. The rest of those bubbles are what we've experienced over the last 5 or 6 years. In January 2016, we implemented Bill 73. Now that was a process initiated under the Liberal government at that time, and they made a number of changes. And then we had a change in government, and then the Conservative government have given us the rest of those changes. So all of the adjustments in the dark green are what we've experienced through those 4 different bills that I talked about. Next slide, please. And again, it's a lot easier for me just to quote the bills, but there's actually the associated acts with each of those bills. So I'm just going to refer to the bills because it's too much of a mouthful to try and name the details of each of those acts. So I'll go through the changes that we experienced through those 4 different pieces of legislation. Next slide. Prior to seeing the development charge, these recent changes, the Act was set up so that we could include any service that the municipality provided, but the Act said, here's a couple of exclusions that you can't include. So they said the general headquarters for the headquarters for the general administration. So basically space associated with council, with the CAO, with legal, with finance, clerks, etc. We couldn't collect for grants to give to hospitals. We couldn't purchase parkland through the development charge, and we couldn't put in cultural services. The change that they've made now is they basically said, you can't include anything unless we tell you that you can include a specific service. So it's actually flipped it around the opposite way. And they've deemed these 20 different services as being what any municipality can include in their DC. The ones that are highlighted in green are those services that we provide in your bylaws. So you can see water, wastewater, storm. Services related to a highway are basically your roads, sidewalks, active transportation. We've got fire, library, and then they combine parks and recreation as one service. So as I said, they flipped it around, and these are the only eligible services that we can now collect for. Next slide. If you recall, and we were sending kind of summaries as these different bills came through, but initially Bill 108 was offering only 8 services for municipalities to provide. And there was a number of other adjustments, plus what they were saying was all the other ineligible services would be dropped under the Planning Act, and you could consider collecting them under a community benefits charge. Community benefits charge is what you use for high density development, where you, under Section 37 of the Planning Act, you get some added contributions. And you'll see that as we go through this presentation that they've actually put a very tight framework around that CBC, the community benefit charge. Initially, it was very expanded. And as I say, all the rest of the services were going into this charge, and you can impose that on singles, on medium density, on high density. So it was going to be expanded to be quite a significant charge. Now they've reduced it. So as you can see, they've increased for development charges. They put back a whole bunch of services. And as I'll present in a minute, they've put a very tight time frame, a tight framework around that CBC charge. What Bill 108 actually, at the end of the day, all it did was impose certain cash flow or installment payment requirements for certain types of developments. So that if you see the bottom 4 bullets, you can see that for rental housing or for institutional developments, you would be allowed, instead of paying at the time of your building permit, you, as of right, can pay in 6 installments. Basically, you'll pay at the date of occupancy. So that'll be delayed from where we used to collect it. And then from that date of occupancy, you'll pay 1/6, and then you'll pay the residual on the anniversary over the next 5 years. So you make it in 6 payments. The nonprofit housing, you're allowed to pay over 20 years, so 21 payments. They've also introduced another concept, which is they are going to freeze the site. If I come in for a site plan application or I come in with a zoning bylaw amendment application, the day that the municipality accepts that completed application, whatever the rates are in effect on that day, the development charges are frozen. And they're frozen until 2 years after you've given approval to those applications. So I then have, once I receive, if I'm making the application, once I receive approval from the city, I have 2 years to get moving on that development. If I do, then those rates are frozen, and I'll qualify that in a moment. Or if it's longer than 2 years, I lose that that ability to go with those older rates, and I have to go with whatever the development charges are of the day. The last bullet basically says for the installment payments for the 3 different categories above, or for the freezing of the charge based on the 2 different applications. The municipality can impose interest on those payments. So if I'm paying, let's say $100 over 5 or 6 years, I can add interest each and every year. So those payments go from $100 up to say 105, and then they go up to 110. The next payment's 115, etc. So that I know that you've already dealt with these installment payments, and you've aligned yourself with the region's interest rate so that you're working in unison with the region. Next slide. So most of the changes got put into Bill 197, and it's the one that basically added back in a number of services. So now we have 20 eligible services that we can collect for. They've introduced this new concept of a class of service, and that's in order to recognize that in certain instances, maybe an infrastructure or a service or whatever isn't necessarily 100%, water, 100% sewer or whatever. Good example is when we take a look, we have growth-related studies right now in your bylaw. So we're picking up master plans, we're picking up official plan amendments, perhaps secondary plans, these different types of planning studies. As you can see, planning is no longer an eligible service. But when we look at the official plan, there's a lot of policies there that deal with roads, with water, with sewer, with parks and recreation, et cetera. So what we can do is we can still, because of this class of service, we can still include a component of that official plan that relates to those services. So we'd have to break the official plan maybe down into 7 or 8 different components, break it apart, identify it as part of a service, and then we add it back together. So a little bit confusing, a little bit extra work for the consultant. But basically, for the most part, we can continue to collect for many of the planning studies because we can work with this class of service definition. So just to note that if you don't see certain services, we may be able to recover portions of them depending on type of infrastructure that's included. A big one, which is being looked at as part of this update, is they've removed that mandatory 10% deduction. So before we'd get down to the bottom in the calculation and the act would say knock off an extra 10% and the municipality had to fund those costs. So as part of this process, they've removed that. And as well, we used to be limited to a 10-year planning horizon for all the soft services. And once again, they've removed that time frame so that now we can use any planning horizon. Let's say if you come with a Parks and Recreation master plan, they're looking at needs over 20 years. We can take all of those projects and consider them as part of the DC, whereas before we'd have to limit ourselves to what you were constructing within the 10 years of your forecast. Next slide. The next one, this one is the second part of the CB of Bill 197. We're not doing the community benefit charge right now. That's something that finance will be considering, come back and have a dialogue with council whether to move ahead. But when I indicated that they put a very tight framework around it, what they've done is they've limited the charge. It can only be imposed now on buildings that are 5 stories or higher, and it must contain a minimum of 10 residential units. So it could be, a complete apartment, or it could be a mixed use type of building. And if it's mixed use and it meets those 2 conditions, you can still impose the charge on that mixed use development. Now, one of the limitations is, though, that for any of those eligible buildings, you can only charge 4% of the market value of land. So if it was a $1 million piece of property, 4% says you can't collect more than $40,000 for that acre of land that's worth $1 million. If it's worth 10 million, then you can get $400,000. So now it's all a math calculation, and it's based on the market value of the individual properties. These are basically, you can now include parkland dedication, which was eligible before, cultural services, any DC service that basically you can't collect for anymore under the DC could be pulled in, such as right now you have parking services included. We would have to move that over to the CBC. So that's something that, as I say, finance staff will be considering and coming back for a discussion with council on that. Next slide, please. And the last one, Bill 213, was basically to introduce an exemption. And that exemption is that you may not impose your charge on colleges and universities. For the most part, colleges were exempt because of a case law decision, but universities weren't. So the province has come back, and now if those universities receive senior levels of government funding, then they're eligible to receive that exemption if they build or expand buildings in your municipality. Next slide. And again, please. So very high level, what we do in the DC, just as a refresher, we consider growth, the amount, type, location. We look at the servicing needs and translate that into capital projects. There's a number of deductions we have to make. So we go from a gross cost potentially down to a net cost. That net cost has to be split between a residential benefit, non-residential benefit, and then we divide it back by the growth to come up with the charges. So residential's based on low, medium, high density types of residential units. Non-residential is imposed on a per square foot basis. So the building size determines the amount of the charge that you'll actually pay. Next slide, please. And again. So for the most part, for the servicing updates, we're looking at parks and recreation. That's what they deem the term now, parks and rec, where formerly you called it indoor and outdoor recreation services. So a slight title change, but in essence means the same thing. Library services and then growth studies, which we formerly called administration or administrative studies, is now continues to be eligible, but it's a class of service because some of those projects we have to break apart into service components. So for the most part, from a transparent perspective, there should be no real change. The only change is that for each of those, we're going to go back in under this calculation and actually increase the charge because we're putting back in that 10% that we deducted. Next slide. And again. So just part of the calculations we do, and I didn't, it was included in one of the deductions, is we have to look at historic service standards. And it's a requirement where we look backwards and we do a quality quantity calculation. Anyway, at the end of the day, what that does is it puts a ceiling on how much we can recover. So every time we do an update or we do the full-blown study, we have to go in and analyze the service standards. It doesn't apply to water, wastewater, storm. It doesn't apply to transit, that historic look, but everything else we've got to go in and look at. So as part of this study, you'll see in the appendix, we've updated those calculations because it's something we have to measure ourselves against to see if we're limited in putting in all of that 10%, which at the end of the day, we're not, but we still have to go through that calculation. Next slide. So just when we're looking at the growth studies, you'll see that category. One of the things that you'll note is that we're going to have to split that category into one which we'll call growth studies and one which we'll call dash parking. As I've noted, parking, municipal parking is no longer an eligible service. And therefore, we had some studies in there looking at municipal parking for the municipality over the longer term. That study has to be deleted as of September 18th, 2022. So they've given us 2 years to transition into these new calculations. So what we will be doing is continuing that parking component as long as we can, but then as of September 18th, it mandatorily has to drop off. So you see, we'll split it into those two categories. So it's very clear what we're removing. Next slide, please. And one more, please. So just very quickly, the actual changes to what was there in the prior study. We've removed the 10% mandatory deduction on the parks and recreation, the library, the growth studies. For the most part, the project lists have not changed other than to rejig the calculation. However, within the growth studies, we have made adjustments to the projects. There was a few studies that are no longer eligible, which we've removed. And then we've added 1 or 2 back in, such as an additional study for doing the DC update that we're doing currently. So some minor adjustments within that category of service. Next slide. And again. So very simply, these are based on, if you look at your development charge bylaw, it was based on 2019 dollars. The Act lets you, once you pass the bylaw, you can index it every year. And the Development Charges Act give you a specific StatsCan index that you can use to adjust it year after year. So right now, your bylaw actually, or the charges are actually in 2020 dollars because you index as of July 1st. So last year you moved it up for that capital cost index. But right now, we have to go back and look at the original bylaw, readjust the bylaw, and then finance staff will then take that updated number and they'll bring it up to current day levels. So making the presentation in 2019 dollars, you can see these services were originally $9,620. The updated calculations are just below $11,000, and this is on a single detached unit. So that's an increase of about $1,363. Now you'll note that the growth related studies, you can see the one that's related to parking. There's $6 going towards that parking study. And as of September 18th of next year, that $6 will actually drop off. If we look at the non-residential charge for retail, which is the next slide, you can see that currently you charge $14.58. We've added about $1.83 in cost, so that takes you to a little over $16 per square foot for retail types of development. On the next slide, you can see for non-retail, so that'd be institutional, industrial, offices. You can see we're going from 1082 to 1211. So that's about $1.29 adjustment per square foot of building space. Next slide. And this presents the totality of the charge with these updated adjustments. So you can see that the total charge will be for a single detached is going to be $19,793. Medium density, which is your townhouse units, $16,200. And then your large and small apartments going from a low of about $8,700 up to about $13,500. And then you can see we've given you the non-residential. We've presented it both in square meters as well as in square feet. Some people are imperial, some are metric. So we've given it to you in both mediums. Next slide. And if we look at that indexing, because right now you indexed it to July 1st, 2020. And once again, it'll be indexed July 1st this year. But currently those charges are actually $21,400 for your the updated calculations. And you can see correspondingly, all the rest of the calculations have been adjusted. Next slide. And so I'll hand it back to Dave and I'll let him complete the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Gary. Just last few slides here. As I indicated, we're updating the bylaws. And also involves some policy update. Gary described very well the updates from the Bill 108 and 197, and our bylaws can reflect these changes of the respective the freezing of the DC rates based on site plan and zoning bylaw amendment plan approvals for 2 years, and the development charge deferrals opportunities for nonprofit housing and rental housing institutional developments. So bylaws will reflect that, and the classification of the growth studies as well. Also, the reference to the interest policy that applies to these deferred situations or the frozen charges on site plan and zoning bylaws will be put into these bylaws as well. Some policy changes, just one in particular. Different type of developments are coming up, and one that's been pretty popular of late is stacked townhouses. We're amending that classification in our bylaw from being in the other multiples category where most townhomes are to the apartment categories, which is a lower rate. That's consistent with most GTA municipalities, and it's more appropriate to the nature of these developments being smaller than a typical townhouse developments. And we're updating and refining some definitions based on current types of development. I've listed them all there. I'm not going to go through them, but we are updating those definitions in our bylaws there to the last point. Next slide, please, Ryan. And next slide. We are updating the 2 area specific bylaws. We currently have 8 in the city, and the top 2 that are in green are being updated. Those are primarily employment related blocks that are being updated. The majority of the rest of them are of the bylaws don't expire for another 3 years, and they are largely greenfield development bylaws. Next slide. And next slide. So the Bayview Northeast area specific is, as this map's a little small, but it's bordered by the 404 to the east, Leslie to the west, Major Mackenzie to the south, and Elgin Mills to the north. Next slide. And the update of that, as I mentioned, this bylaw expires in early July 21. We've updated the infrastructure needs in the area as well as the developable lands, and there's been quite a bit of a decrease in the developable lands, approximately 29 hectares less. And that's largely because back in 2016, we believed an official plan designation for the lands east of the Rouge River for the Mount Pleasant Cemetery to be employment lands. And that was reflected in the 2016 update, and that was thus we include those lands as a part of that charge. We're going back as the Mount Pleasant Cemetery organization is going back with the long-standing zoning, which permits cemetery uses for these lands, and then, of course, exempts them from the bylaw. And that's really a reduction of almost 21 hectares of land being removed out of it, and has a significant impact on the charge. The total charge of the cost of the infrastructure remaining in the block is about $8.1 million, and that's spread over 18.6 hectares to derive a new proposed charge of $434,900 per net developable hectare. Next slide, please. And the next slide. So the Headford block, Headford excluding the storm component, that's bordered by, again, the 404 to the east, Leslie to the west, Major Mackenzie to the north, and Orlando Drive to the south, which is about almost 2/3 down the map there. Next slide. And this bylaw also expires July 11th and 21. We've updated the infrastructure requirements and the lands, developable lands remaining. We engage the services of WSP to get an updated level C cost of the Vogel Bridge, and that's the most significant element in this bylaw. And that's the bridge that crosses the Rouge River. Based on the preliminary design of the bridge, same design we had in 2012, and there's been a significant cost increase there. They came back, WSP came back with a net cost at level C about $9.7 million. That's about approximately a $4 million increase from the original estimates of it that was a part of the 2016 update. So the total cost of the infrastructure in that area, in that block, is $11.4 million, and that's spread over almost 47 net developable hectares, and it derives a new charge of $243,700 per net developable hectare. Next slide, please. And last slide. Okay, so here's the next steps as we go forward. As I mentioned this morning, we met with the development community and presented this material. And of course, we met this afternoon and presented the material with council here. After that, we're following the legislative timeline requirements that are provided in the Development Charges Act. We need to have the a release of the draft report, background study, and bylaws 2 months in advance of the actual passage of them. So we're going to have those ready and available for public consumption and developer community consumption by April 9th. We have to have a required public meeting of council for this development charges. We're planning that for May 5th. And then, of course, we're planning for the bylaw passage of June 9th, 2021. I believe, next slide, Ryan. So I turn it back to you, Mr. Acting Mayor. I think you have you're on mute, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dexter and Mr. Scanlon. So members of council, do you have any questions regarding the information presented to us to Mr. Scanlon? Deputy Mayor Pirelli, go ahead.
Thank you, Acting Mayor DePaula. Through you to Mr. Scanlon. Thank you for the presentation, first of all. My question is just one. The community benefit, you said the new rules allow up to is it up to 4% of the land value?
That's correct, 4%, but you have to go through and prepare, they call it a strategy, but you have to do a background study to justify imposing the 4%, but that is the maximum amount.
It's a maximum.
That's correct.
Okay. And the second question I have, when do they make that calculation?
The calculation's just before building permit, so it'd be based on the market value the day before taking out the permit to start construction on the building.
So that's basically the highest value.
That's correct. At
that point. Perfect. Thank you very much. And thank you for the presentation.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Pirelli. Anyone else? Councillor Munch?
Sorry, it took me a while to unmute that, guys and gals. I have lots of questions. I want to go to the first one. Thank you, through you, the chair. Very good at presentations. Good to see you again, Mr. Scanlon. Further on Deputy Mayor's comments with regard to based on the date, I'm going to just start there. So can we go back on that date on when it's being evaluated at that 4%? So it's as of site plan or as of when exactly again? Sorry.
building permit. Through you, Mr. Mayor, it's the market value the day before building permit.
Day before building permit, okay. I'll write that down. Oh, okay, so I've got some questions here, if I may. All right, so can you just start, what was some of the feedback from what happened this morning that you can share? Because I wasn't in that meeting, and I would have liked members of council to be aware of that, so we hear what the industry is as opposed to getting at both. But so I would say in the future, it'd been really great if we could have been there, not as a participant, but certainly as an auditor. I would have liked to hear what the industry was saying as opposed to us trying to figure out what the concerns are. So having said that, can you give us, members of the council and the public, some of the feedback that was in that meeting that you heard of concerns to start?
Sure, I can take that one. To you, Mr. Mayor. We presented the same presentation to the development community this morning, and there wasn't a lot of concern. I guess it was brand new information to them, and though they have time to take it away and absorb it, and of course they'll have the background study April 9th, and once they go read, they can bring their concerns forward to the public meeting or even ahead of time. Some of the concerns were to some of the items that they had appealed us in 2016 to the OMB on, as well as their reiterative appeals that they brought forward in 2019. The 2016 appeal came back from the board last year in 2020. It took a long time, but it came back, and it came back in favor of the city. And there were a lot of concerns about the use of area specifics instead of citywide for certain engineering projects and so forth. We indicated to them that we weren't opening up the engineering component for this study, so it stays status quo pretty much. and that we were just opening up the soft service component for the changes in legislation. And we made it very clear to them that this update really was about implementing the changes to legislation. They were at a point they may want another meeting in the future. They had decided to get back together for a discussion. They would let us know. But otherwise, they didn't have a lot of questions otherwise.
Thank you. So if I can, I've got some questions. So I want to see if it was heard, not in a particular order. I just kind of jumped a little bit. So, because I've read the information a lot, lots of information there. Thank you so much to digest for me anyway. So on slide 26, we talk, I'm going to start the growth rates for parking, which is an area that I'm very focused on because it affects housing affordability in my view. And housing affordability is something that we're talking about in our future and in our past plan that really hasn't had success, given that Richmond Hill is the second least housing affordable municipality in Ontario. So on slide 26, what's the growth rate studies parking? I didn't understand what that was. So slide 26, it says the growth rate studies parking. Can you explain that for me, please, through the acting mayor?
Could we have the slides put up on the screen possibly to help the rest of council see that? Thank you.
So growth rates parking, this component will expire on September 18th, 2022 to the transition provisions of Bill 197.
So through you, Mr. Mayor, it's growth related studies. So, where we do master plans, we do forecast and servicing needs. There's a study in your current or part of the background study we had included parking studies. And so that one has to be removed because parking is no longer an eligible service. We must remove that study from this growth studies component. We can keep it in until September 18th, 2022, but then it has to be removed.
So what is that parking criteria now? I don't understand that, sorry.
Parking is an eligible service today, but it no longer is an eligible service as of September 18th next year. So because they've changed the legislation, they've removed parking services. So we had a parking study in there. We have to remove that study.
So it's simply a cost that they're removing then? Or
Yes,
is it?
correct.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so going back to my list there. Also, Bill 108, the DC rate is frozen for site plan and zoning bylaw amendments until 2 years after approval. Can you explain me how explain the DC rate that's being frozen for 2 years? Can you give me an example of that, please?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. So I think the let's say the 2-bedroom apartment rate, let's say they were going to build a building, all 2-bedroom apartments, so it was 14,200. That rate would then be the rate that they're focused in on into the future. So let's say 2 years from now, you approve that application. They've got 2 more years to approve for you to get going with that development. You're allowed under your inflation policy to increase that charge by 5% per year. So roughly that's going to increase by about $700 each and every year, okay, over the 4-year period. So that's what they're talking about. You can take that charge and you can add inflation. If we come in, let's say 2 years from now as stage 2, and we took that 2-bedroom rate and increased it to $20,000, hypothetically. You can't impose that $20,000 charge. You can only impose the original $14,000 that's been inflated for the 4 years. You can't use that new charge unless you don't proceed with your development within 2 years. Let's say you get going 3 years from now, that $20,000 will now be in effect because you've expired your time horizon to use that exemption or that frozen rate.
So the challenge there, I guess, on the financing side, I can get it. But what happens on the planning side I guess there's these two questions. What if a party says, I want to move forward with my application, but the process has taken me beyond that 2-year threshold? We've had a situation this term whereby we've had parties saying, we don't want to pay this extra rate and we're looking for some support. What happens going forward if someone says, hey, I want to move forwards, but the process didn't allow me to go forwards without 2 years? Is there then an LPAT challenge? And then how is that going forward? As was mentioned earlier, we've already had parties this morning have said that they challenged us in the last LPAT or OMB. I don't want that to continue going forwards where we're consistently trying to have to go through behind court cases or through LPAT and have legal charges on discussions on how we're moving through a DC bylaw when we're our planning side and our finance side aren't totally in sync.
Well, I guess there will be there will be bumps along the way, but plain and simple, the act, it just says you've got, after you approve the application. So if I approve it as of today, you have 2 years to get going with that development. By the time you reach that point of approval, I would imagine that there's clarity in what their financial obligations would be. You have a bylaw, they know what the rules are. Within that bylaw, that's part of what we're doing is spelling out these conditions. So if they read the bylaw, it's right there in black and white. If they choose at the time of building permit to challenge it, under the Development Charges Act, there is, you can only put in a complaint. You cannot appeal the charge. What you can do is complain that the bylaw's been applied incorrectly or there's been a calculation error. If it's anything outside of that, they say, I don't want to pay it. They should have challenged the bylaw. Once the bylaw is in effect, the bylaw's in effect.
Yeah. So the challenge we have is that if an applicant wants to come forward and says, okay, we're willing to move forwards in 2 years, and we're okay with 2 years, but for whatever reason, if we can't implement that for 2 years, that may not be a fault of the applicant, then they're effectively hostage. So what happens if the situation, what happens if they say, hey, look, 2 years and 5 days later, they finally get their application through and we say, okay, well, we've had an increase. It's challenging for them to budget and challenging for them to apply if we go into purpose-built rentals or anything else at that point, how we affects the rent, which hurts the affordability, right?
So through you, Mr. Mayor, between when they file the application to when you approve it, that could be 3 years, 5 years, the rate remains frozen. It's after you approve the application that 2-year clock starts. So I would believe that as of the time they actually get the application, then they have 2 years. They should know what all of the costs are at that particular point. So the rates are frozen plus inflation or indexing, whatever we want to call it, interest. But it's only 2 years after you finally give the approval. So that could be 5 years for them to get the approval. And then after the 5 years, they get an extra 2 years. So it could be 7 years before they actually have to pay.
So when we say approval, we're talking about site plan or draft plan or both?
Approval of the application of the site plan and or the OPA.
And or the OPA?
Yes.
Okay, I got it. Okay, thank you. Okay, next question I have. With regards to Bill 108, the DC rate is frozen for a site plan or zoning bylaw amendments for 2 years after approval. So that timing is 5 + 2. That's what we just went through, right?
That's correct.
Okay, got it. Okay.
That's correct.
Next one, Bill 197 can only be applied to higher density development where there are more than 10 residential units and 5 more stories. So what happens in the scenario where if I want to do, and it's open to discussion here, let's say, for example, we want to create jobs, we encourage people to create jobs and they do a commercial building. And they do a commercial building and they say, okay, well, I can't do more than 5 units of residential. So I'm going to do 4 stories. I can do 4 units of residential as long as I go above 4 stories, then that's the threshold, right?
They can, it's 5 stories or higher, and within, so they could have 30 stories. If they have no residential units, then there's no CBC. If they have 10 residential units or more, then you can apply the CBC.
Got it. Okay.
1 minute.
Thank you. On slide, and if I don't finish, I'll just do a second round. So on slide 33 in yellow, references to parking. So if we can go to slide 33, we've got the yellow and the reference to parking there. Can you go through that, please?
As we explained through you, Mr. Mayor, that's growth studies. So that is the study that was in your last, in the background study. It's in your charge right now. But parking won't be eligible after an eligible service after September 18th next year. So we've separated it, and that $6 charge will drop off as of that date.
Okay, okay, so next thing is when I look at those rates on the updated development charges throughout, when I did my comparison, I was seeing rates of 11%, 11.71 for outdoor recreation services, 13% for parks and recreation, indoor 15.86%, 14%. The average total for updated calculating charge residential is 14.16% increase. And the increase for updated non-residential retail is 10.23%. And then the other is going down. So these rates going up from 2 years,
Time.
10, 15%, that's pretty high. So these reports are being received today, right? When are we going through an approval stage?
Okay, that'll be your last question,
Yeah.
Councilor Munch, unless we
Fair
go
enough.
second round.
If I can go second round after, that'd be fine.
Mr. Scanlon?
We will be releasing the report in early April 6th, I think. And that starts the public process. And then from the day we release the background study, council cannot consider the bylaw for any less than 60 days. So once we file it, you've got at least 60 days before you as a council would consider the bylaw.
Okay, thank you. I'll go second round. I got a few more questions, so thank you.
Okay, so, this is an education session, and the purpose of today is for councilors to gain an understanding of the development charge update process. They'll be coming back to us a month from now, still in draft form, for more questions, detailed questions. And of course, it'll be then going to the public. And I guess my question is it next month's draft that's going to be released to the public and all stakeholders?
If I may, I'll take it, Gary. Yeah, April 9th, it'll be the background study and the draft bylaws will be released to publicly to all stakeholders, and then they will have time to comment on that. And our next planned session to bring it forward to council is at the public meeting. But we will provide the background studies to all the council as well, and all the draft material on April 9th as well, right?
Okay, so this draft version right now is for our benefit only, but Councillor Munch was referring to another unveiling with stakeholders.
Well, my only question here is, as we're going forwards, when I look forward and
hold on, Councillor Munch. I'll give you a chance it sounds like you want us to ask questions.
Yeah, okay.
What was being referenced? This was discussed yesterday or today?
No, this morning there was a meeting, I understand.
There's a meeting this morning with...
Yeah, we had a meeting this morning, sir, with the development community.
It was okay. So they've got the same heads up that council's got. The development community has had a preview.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you. So I don't see any other councillors with questions at this time. I'll go back to Councillor Munch. You have some other questions, and if you will, Councillor, I do need a motion to receive the presentation today.
Yeah, I'll gladly move that motion to receive the report. Just two relatively brief discussion or questions or go forwards. When I look at that, I see an increase of a 600 square foot unit. If we were to go forwards with the existing way, I see it going up $9,384 or to $9,384, which is a $700 increase, or that's an 8% increase, which is pretty substantial given today where we were in 2 years. You know, that's a really big increase in cost. And this is something where if we're going to talk about housing affordability and we keep raising the cost, because all these costs are usually transferred to the end user. And when we start increasing costs at, you know, double, triple, quadruple the rate of inflation, really what happens is if the public or the market of people who are working aren't getting 4 times the increase of inflation, that means that shelter costs, disproportionate amount of income are coming forwards, and that makes it more difficult for housing affordability. So in seeing that in 2010, we had housing affordability as a concern for 30% of all units going forward, which we weren't able to achieve. And now going forward, it's again on the agenda forward. These DC charges have a direct impact to that approach. And we really need to have a dialogue to say, what are our priorities as a community? Or do we want to be competitive? I mean, how are we going to address this? We have, as opposed to January 25th, 2021, so 6 weeks ago, Richmond Hill was seen as the second least housing affordable community in Ontario. And when we are now moving forwards and saying that we're going to be charging rates at just a local rate of 8% increase, makes it really, really tough for those people on fixed incomes, makes it really tough for working families, makes it really tough for people to afford. And seeing that our growth targets aren't being met with regard to approvals of housing, that means that we have a shortage in housing, raising costs because of simply supply and demand, plus government costs, plus and these DCs, plus the regional costs that are going up. We heard last week at the region, $3.8 billion going at the region. All of this is going to be impacting. And I say, when I read that, when they're going DCs, I'm surprised nobody else is raising that. So any comment on that? And then I got one last question.
Mr. Dexter, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Acting Mayor. So the majority, if not almost all of the increase of that you're seeing in the charges is a result of the legislative changes of no longer having to deduct the 10% portion for soft service. That's the indoor, outdoor recreation and library. In the past, before this legislation, as Gary described, we would have to find 10% of the cost for any of the infrastructure or assets that we would place in those areas to service the new community, right? So that they have the same services, recreation and library services as existing communities in Richmond Hill. So that 10% we'd have to find in our own reserves. And then our reserves are, as you've seen through other sessions with Budget Committee of the Whole and Council, are finite, quite finite. So if these assets are going in place now, the legislation allows development to pay for more growth, to get closer to paying for full growth, right? That's what it does here, right? And to assist municipalities to in place infrastructure to the community, and that's what this has done here, and that's why you're seeing the increases there. So it's a favorable move and a favorable legislation for municipalities.
Again, I totally hear you that. So along those lines, on the finance side and on the planning side, if there's a disconnect between the planning side, when we say a forecast similar to the 2019 report, we, as per the 2019 report, as per the regional plan, if we are going to be a survival municipality and actually just to have the opportunity to have parks and sidewalks and community centers and police stations, what have you, and we say that we're going to grow at 20%, 40,000 people in 10 years is what the forecast was. We're going to be growing at 50% in the region, but we're only growing by 20% as a municipality. So we're half the growth rate of the rest of the region of Aurora, Newmarket, East Gwillimbury, Georgina, Markham, Vaughan, and we're only meeting 40% of that target. So we're 40% of half of what the region is. We're putting DCs in based upon a forecast of what we're doing we said we were going to do 1,900 units approval in 2019, 1,900 units approval in 2020, I think 1,800 units in 2021. We're at 40% 8% or less of that, if we're expecting our DCs to come in to put stormwater management in Ward 4 or what have you, yet we're not bringing the revenue in, yet we're charging high rates, then that means that the people that are coming in are paying excessively high growth rates for planning that we're not achieving, for growth that we're not even coming close to. How do we reconcile the forecast financing and make sure that planning understands and council understands that if we don't achieve these planning numbers, we are going to be impacting dramatically our housing affordability and growth targets, which are going to impact our core services long-term. And then, as you just pointed out, hey, we don't want to tape out our reserves. I would argue that if we're not growing as a municipality as per our forecast, then we can't spend as if we are growing at a rate. So when we say, hey, we want the stormwater management, but haven't grown at that rate, you can't spend that money because we haven't earned it. So I say to you, like, I don't believe it's the only way to keep charging high rates to hurt where we're trying to go. And then on the other side, have planning go through to a concept plan for housing affordability, which we have no chance of ever doing because we don't really have any intention of ever trying to meet housing affordability. So last point.
Councillor, I share your concerns, but what's your question?
I just say that when we're charging 8% increase in our DCs based upon a forecasted rate that we're not achieving, in fact, that forecasted rate is doubled because we're not getting the growth and those people coming forward. Or else how are we going to get the money? Like if we say we're going to get 2,000 units, we only get 1,000 units, but we're expecting 8% growth. We only got 8% on 1,000. We didn't get 8% on 2,000.
Yeah, that is a good question, and I do want to hear the answer to that. So, you know, if I could rephrase, how does that work when you're forecasting an amount? We have X amount of dollars that we need, and we're trying to achieve it based on 1,900 units. If we only build 1,000, how are we getting in the monies that we need for DC through DC charges? Mr. Dexter?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. So it's a matter of considering, because the development charges are calculated based on levels of service in the municipality in the past of 10 years and the cost of the actual infrastructure, the assets are going to be in place. If your growth is slower than your DC study and forecast indicates, it's a consideration and a discussion that council needs to have on timing of inputting and building that infrastructure. It doesn't mean that the less number of houses come in pay a whole bunch more development charges. It's not that at all. It's about, okay, we don't have enough development charges here in our reserve because we haven't collected enough. We cannot build this. The region's struggling with this now. Or if there is a want or a need to build it ahead of all the development coming in, if it hasn't come in fast enough, then we would consider using, debt to fund a portion of it for what DCs haven't come in yet. And when those development charges finally come in, we use those development charges to pay for the debt. There's no increase in the rates that's related to lack of volume of growth.
Okay, so coming back to that. So for example, using that example.
You have about 30 seconds, Councillor.
Okay, real quick, using that example, if we said we're going to grow at 20%, but we want to grow at 10, and the fire department says we need 2 years to get that fire truck, and we need to get that money for that 2-year fire truck, when does finance go back to council to say, we have not met our growth targets and you need to push back some of those operating costs because we don't need that fire truck that you ordered 2 years in advance because you never really met your growth targets? So our 2020 and our 2019 growth targets, I haven't seen any numbers come in to tell us what exactly those numbers are, although I've been tracking it on the approvals that we've done. And I'm showing 35% of our forecast, but I don't think members of council realize that we're 65% expenditure was pre-spending from that growth that never happened. And how do other departments like operations for snowplow and road services and fire services, for example, how do we do that? So how are we communicate internally, and how is council hearing that?
Okay, we'll leave it there, and if you can address those comments, Mr. Dexter.
Sure. Every year as a part of the capital budget process, projects are brought forward, growth-related projects are brought forward. And to say the example of the fire vehicle, that brought forward, council considers it. Finance tells council that there's not sufficient monies in the fire development charge reserve fund because we haven't collected enough yet. So there's two options. If council considers the fact is, yes, we need to get that fire truck now because growth will start happening in the area and we want to make sure that vehicle is there, or delay it maybe a year, two, for more development charge monies to come in. If the decision's today, we need it today, then that's where we consider issuing some debt, that the payments of that debt, the servicing of the debt would be done through the development charges that finally come in. So it's pretty much the same decision as deferring it to signing the bill today. It's all based on timing when the growth happens there. And council's a part of that, those discussions in depth as part of the capital budget process.
So if I can just give 10 seconds, if I may, just 10
Councillor Munt,
seconds.
You've had 2 rounds of
Okay.
5 minutes each, and
Okay.
your staff's done a good job in answering. But I have the same questions. I'm going to carry on a little bit with that line of questioning. But Mr. Dexter, I think there continues to be a bit of a problem, and it's a little problematic for council when projections are made that are inconsistent across departments, and there's a silo of information. It came to a head last time when we discussed development charges, and each department makes projections, and it's just extremely inconsistent. When one department says we're going to have X number of units, and we need to acquire capital assets to correlate with this number of units, and this is going to be our growth, and therefore we need this number of full-time employees in that area, or it's just a little bit alarming because I'm sure the qualified staff that we have in each department has an internal mechanism of handling the needs in each department, but the way in which it's communicated to council, and I think, Mr. Dexter, it's your responsibility as treasurer to coordinate these various projections, because we can't have one set of projections in one department and another set in another department, and then it's confusing for council. And I think we need to have some across the board standard reporting when it comes to financial matters and capital needs and our city's growth. We have a crisis when it comes to growth here in Richmond Hill. We are woefully behind targets, and the region is just beginning to acknowledge a bit of a problem with their slowdown, real significant slowdown. And because they're down to 50%, but we're down to 30% of our targets, and we're already projected to have a slower growth than other municipalities because we've run out of green space. So I have all these concerns, Mr. Scanlon. I appreciate your presentation of the document and our opportunity here to understand. But the region has declared a housing affordability crisis, and 39% of the cost of building and offering homes to our residents comes from the government levels, and very little of that is from the province or the federal government. The bulk of it is from the region and the city, and that's so we are contributing to driving up the costs of providing housing to our residents. And there's 3 factors that go into that, and one is the time it takes to get an approval, and the cost of carrying land and other assets and financing costs. So there's a time cost, obviously a DC charge cost, and that's what we're dealing with today. And then it's the community benefits section. The province is recognizing a need to put a cap on seems like a never-ending escalation of these costs. So I think we're involved in a really good exercise here. We have to take a more critical look at the projects. I'd like this is an update right now, but we, I think, need a more comprehensive review of all of our scheduled capital projects, and there are perhaps some some projects that were on a wish list 10 years ago that aren't necessary any longer. I'd rather see a lower DC charge and more activity, more housing, more supply is going to mean a more affordable product at the end of the day. We need a more cost-effective way to cooperate with our partners coming in, especially on purpose-built rental and on walkable developments. And we want to create a low-cost housing option here in Richmond Hill. DCs are a big part of it, but we want housing units that don't even you don't require a car, because we're going to have everything close by. So as I'm talking here, and this is a good thing, I see two other councillors have indicated a request to speak. So Councillor West and then Councillor Barrows. Councillor West.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This has been an interesting discussion, and I think there's some valid points made there, but there are some things that I'm not sure that I entirely agree with. I guess I've been through the DC process on council before, and it always strikes me that this is an incredibly complex process. However, at the end of the day, it's actually not that complex, because the general idea is that whatever we collect for growth will pay for that growth. And how we come to the number and estimate the number and do the best that we can to make sure we account for all of the costs of that growth, and that's up to our staff, and that's the complex part. But the simple part is, if we don't collect it through a development charge and we have to pay for it some other way, one of the only other ways that we can collect it is through taxpayer dollars, and that's not fair either. So I'm not in favor of any real discussion, for the most part, of reducing the development charges, because it is the fairest way that we've come up with on how growth will pay for growth. I had a question actually that I think I vaguely recall at some past date, about deferring things and the issuance of debt. Mr. Dexter, through you, Acting Mayor, am I remembering correctly that the debt servicing costs can also be included in development charges?
Mr. Dexter?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, that's correct. For debt servicing for growth projects, that is, yes. Okay.
So if we didn't collect enough to do a project that was urgently needed before the charges to finance that project were completed, we could actually collect the debt servicing, the interest on that amount, right?
That's correct. So basically, future growth that comes in, those funds would be used to service the debt component as a part of those funds.
Okay. The only other point I'd like to make is that, I understand that, the price of a new house when it gets sold is also a very complex thing. I mean, the developer, like any business, will, add in all the costs, add in, all that other stuff, come up with a price, including a profit for the time that it took to do it, and that's the selling price. The thing that I think is really important for council to consider here about the possibility of reducing development charges, which would essentially probably in some cases, or most cases, would mean reducing levels of service, amount of things that we can purchase, like parkland, recreation centers, libraries, all the services that people expect and deserve in Richmond Hill. If we give a small discount of some sort on the development charges so that we won't be able to afford to do some of the things that we want to afford, the small amount that would come off of each residential unit is essentially going to the developer of that property. It's not going off penny for penny off the price of the building itself. So, I mean, there is a relationship with affordability for sure. I won't deny that, but it's not like if $20,000 per unit were knocked off the unit, it doesn't mean the price of the unit is going to sell for $20,000 less. So there is a relationship with affordability, and we do need to have that discussion, but it is not as direct a relationship as what I'm hearing. So anyway, I do want to thank Mr. Scanlon. I've heard you speak a number of times on this, and Mr. Dexter, of course, your staff and yourself have done a good work in taking all of this complexity and stirring it up and making it understandable for the community and for us on council. So I do thank you for that, and I'll leave it at that, Mr. Mayor. I do appreciate that we're going through a process here, and this is the beginning of it, and we'll end up with a result at the end. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I thought I heard you say you were seconding the receipt of the motion. Did I hear you right?
It was actually, you're reading my mind. I didn't actually say it, but I thought it.
Okay, well, thank you, Councillor West. So do we have a motion moved and seconded? Next speaker is Councillor Barrows.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my question is along the lines of the conversation that we're currently having that Councillor West just brought up. When it comes to discounting the development charges, I guess it would just be arbitrarily saying instead of 8%, we want to charge, I'll just pick a number, 6%. Through the chair to Mr. Dexter, what type of mechanism is there to achieve what the acting mayor is suggesting, that it would result in lower charges for residents?
Mr. Mayor, if council, sorry. Yeah.
Go ahead, Mr. Dexter. It's a little bit of took a little liberty with what I was suggesting, but you can answer that. Go ahead, Mr. Dexter.
There. So if council decided they did not want to pass on the fully calculated increase here from reflecting the new legislation and the opportunities for municipalities and pass on a lower charge, then I guess we wouldn't be able to fully fund all the capital items and forecasts that are within the background study that substantiate the charge. So there would have to be a revisit at some point by council and staff of whether a piece of infrastructure asset does not get built or gets built to a lesser level than our past service levels have indicated where those assets are supposed to be at. So we'd have to make decisions on the assets actually that we put in place going forward.
To reiterate the question, what mechanism, Mr. Dexter, is there that if we give the developer a 2% discount, that discount is passed on to the future homeowner? Because that's what's being suggested, that if we have a discounted rate, it'll go right down to the homeowner. How would we articulate that? How would that be shown so that it could actually be proven that it's not just being taken up in, as Councillor West suggested, it's just being taken up by the developer going, hey, I got an extra 2% profit on the project. That's great. I'm still selling the homes at market value. How can the homeowner see that I bought a home below market value because council passed on a 2% development charge savings?
Could I ask you, Mr. Mayor, that maybe Gary, do you have an answer? Gary may be able to give us some legislative.
I guess we don't have an ability to do that, but Mr. Scanlon?
No, through you, Mr. Mayor, no, we don't have an ability to do that. It's a charge. What the developers do with it, if they reduce the house price, that's great. But yes, they could keep the house costs the same and a little bit more profit. So there's no mechanism directly in there.
So that's the answer I expected. That there is no way to track it. There would be no way to prove it. It'd be a very risky situation given that we've got our staff giving us very detailed numbers. So the other question I have is this comment that I keep hearing at council, which is purpose-built rental, inferring that that is the answer to people that can't afford to buy homes in Richmond Hill. This will all of a sudden fix that problem. So I guess maybe the question is to either of the speakers that keep saying this, are you suggesting that purpose-built rental is Ontario housing, it's subsidized? Or is it suggested that it's market rent and people that can't afford to put the down payment, at least they can pay, $2,500 or something a month for a rental? I'm just trying to get clarification on that because I'm not seeing that.
Well, thank you, Councillor Barros. If you're asking me, because I've mentioned it, I could continue to mention it. I think it's one of the ways in which we can address housing affordability crisis. It certainly is a less expensive form of housing, and we do need that. And we've come to a critical head where people are willing to build a building at a 1% return over a long period of time, rather than the full investment of a condo and getting out of the full cost of within a 5 to 10 year frame. The opportunities to make money have dried up, and there's large amounts of money in pension funds and other large investment portfolios that they need a mechanism to generate a return. And now the old tried, tested, and true, I'm going to make 1% a year on residential rents has become viable. And if we could assist with that, we have a glorious opportunity here in Richmond Hill in our transit corridors to provide that much needed, more affordable housing, on the regional definition of what constitutes affordability. So it's something that we're excited about investigating here in Richmond Hill, and the region has been directed to take a look at. So that's what I was referring to. Councillor Munch, you were also asked the question. Councillor Barros was asking, is that what you meant in referring to purpose-built rental?
Well, yeah, I'm just trying to figure out when you say purpose-built rental and affordability crisis.
Well, Councillor, we're past the days where governments are going to go out there and build homes and
what are the numbers that are not affordable, and what does the rental numbers look like that it now makes it affordable for people? Are you suggesting that someone would rent one of these units for life instead of purchasing, and they would find financial freedom through that?
Well, CHMC requires a minimum of 5% down, and I don't think we have any stock available under 400,000. So you're talking about a minimum $20,000 up front. That for a lot of people, that's cost prohibitive and unaffordable, versus putting 4,000 down on first and last, and you have shelter. So it's just a simple, yes, 4,000 is less than 20,000.
But there was no suggestion that we would provide development charge discounts on this, what you refer to as purpose-built rental.
Well,
you were planning to provide that discount across the board?
This is a workshop, so we'll allow some back and forth, and you're asking me some questions, and I'm happy to answer. I've never said anything about discounting development charges. What our treasurer is proposing is a 7% year-over-year increase in our development charge rate. If you look at it, which is huge, inflationary, way above inflation. So it's going to contribute to the cost, and the cost is a factor of what housing prices will ultimately be. Especially when 39% of those costs are borne by payments to governments. Proposing a 7% increase here, we right here as a council will be impacting the cost of building and offering stock when we're in a situation where we have a very, very limited supply, and that's what of housing and a problem with our growth rate. So do we want to do that as a council? Is there other ways that we don't have to offer such a large increase in our development charge rate? That's what I was asking and talking about.
So I'm glad you clarified that, because it certainly sounded like you just wanted to arbitrarily discount it. So I'm assuming what you're then talking about is there's some of the capital projects that are being proposed going forward that you would say are not necessary and that you just want to take out of the plan to bring the numbers down. Is there maybe a couple examples of what projects you might see as being superfluous to the process?
Sure, our sustainability exercise looked at the current 10-year capital plan, and we did a great job in eliminating the need for a civic center, saving $170 million. The observatory was cut from a $70 million upgrade to an 11 million, and maybe be 15 million. So that's just on the 10-year. Now, when Mr. Scanlon proposes out over I think a 30-year period of what our needs are, there's similar huge costs. We have an $8 million park at Yonge and 16th, $8 million on an acre. It's 1 acre. So an $8 million would be the cost of building a 14,000 square foot home. And that would barely fit on an acre. So I don't know what this park is, $8 million park. We've got $14 to $15 million in sewer water, suggested rehabilitation at Elgin Mills and Yonge Street. And do we need to spend $14 million to get across a creek, or is there another way that the city can deal with that stormwater management situation at Yonge and Elgin Mills? I can go on, but
well, please do.
Well, I think that the needs with regards to capital projects, community centers, fire halls, we've seen that it's not necessary to build a new fire station when we could cooperate with Aurora, Stouffville, and others in their northeast quadrant of Richmond Hill to adequately meet our fire servicing needs at a fraction of the cost of building our own station and getting that up to service level standards that we require with full-time employees and equipment and everything else. That's not what we're here to talk about today. This education workshop is for the benefit of council to have a better understanding of how these development charges are derived and the update that's being proposed. We have the best treasurer in the province bringing in 0% increase, and Watson is known as the leading experts when it comes to generating these types of reports for development charge revenue. So we're in great hands in terms of leading us forward. Just I'm hoping that we can even better refine and fine tune this so that we ourselves don't become an obstacle in the housing affordability crisis that is evident across the region.
Mr. Chair, do I still have the floor?
It's all yours.
Okay, thank you.
Have more questions for me?
My question perhaps to Mr. Scanlon. What does 1% represent in dollar figures? So if through the exercise we wanted to draw ourselves down to a different number, what does 1% look like? What magnitude in the budgets?
So are you speaking to the total development charge or the 1% on the limited services that we were presenting to you today?
Just on what we're speaking about today, the comment that we're looking to increase 7% year over year. What does 1% of that represent?
So one of the 7%, the 7% was roughly about $1,400 on a single detached home. So if you only wanted if you wanted to reduce 1% of that 7, then it would be roughly $200. $200 on a single family.
So we're talking about maybe giving a homeowner a $500 break.
Perhaps.
That's all the questions I have today. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Barrows. Deputy Mayor Pirelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thought since this is a workshop and we're all giving our little bit of expertise, as a professional landlord and multifamily home provider for the last 20 years, and just a little bit about my history and 30 years in the real estate business, selling properties like this, I can tell you that there's a big, huge disconnect between development charges and affordability. I don't know why this is part of the discussion. Development charges are, as Councillor West stated, to pay for growth. And if we're going to have growth, we need the money to do that. I can tell you categorically that a developer and a builder who builds any product for that matter has to compete with neighboring communities. And if we provide a discount here in Richmond Hill as Councillor Barrows finally got the answer for, on a single family home of $200 for 1%, I can tell you categorically it's not going to help the affordability factor, and it's not going to address our housing crisis. As a matter of fact, if anybody says that purpose-built rentals are making things more affordable, I would have to disagree. What purpose-built rental does is make the landlord very wealthy. Case in point. It's a lifestyle. Some people want to keep their money to have a different type of lifestyle. There's two economic theories that I remember.
Can I say a point of order here, please?
Councillor Munch.
I appreciate the regional councillors.
You're not going to debate what he's saying.
But having said that, is the region,
you have a problem?
so the region has put a position forward.
Councillor Munch, what's your point of order?
Yeah, the region has put a position forward.
I'm sorry, Councillor Munch, I'm sorry. It's not a point of order.
Well, I haven't even said the point of order. I haven't even finished my sentence.
Procedurally, what is your issue with
The
Mayor has the floor?
The region has put a position forward, and the regional councillor is giving a contrary position to that.
That's debate. That's not a point of order.
Fair
Sorry, Councillor Munch.
But we want to be clear here that there's a disconnect. Right?
You don't point it out when it's your turn to speak. We
Okay,
don't
fair enough.
point
Yeah,
to order to make to clarify anything. Sorry, Deputy Mayor Pirelli, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am interested, Councillor Munch, in how I've differed from the regional's position, but allow me to continue, because I think it's important for the narrative here that we're trying to make a connection between development charges and an affordability crisis. So back to where I was, there's two economic theories that I grew up with, studying from two great professors. And one of them spent his whole life renting, took his extra money and put it into other forms of investment, such as the stock market. Whereas the more traditional investment strategy is to buy an asset. A house is, usually the largest asset that someone will acquire in their lifetime. And when it comes to affordability, many theories circle around the fact that if you have a house and you work towards paying off that house, you enrich yourself. if you look for the rental situation, you're enriching the landlord because you can never catch up. Some of the numbers I heard were, 5% down for CMHC, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. Now that's something we should really look into, because that is going to help people to purchase their own property and work towards paying off their own property and keeping all the profits. If you take a product today, for example, one of these purpose-built rentals today, if you study it, you'll find that a one bedroom apartment will rent for approximately $1,900 to $2,100 today. That's the fair market value. $2,100 will carry about over a $500,000 mortgage.
1 minute.
Thank you. So I would rather see something that, to address the affordability crisis, is how do we get people to purchase their own property so that they enrich themselves as opposed to landlords? Yes, there is a place for landlords. There is a place for them because some people choose the option of renting versus owning. It's a lifestyle choice. What we're talking about, affordability crisis, in either situation, it's a non-starter. It's almost impossible to afford, to suggest that somebody could afford to live and pay $2,100 rent. They're falling further and further and further behind. In my apartment building in Aurora, a 2-bedroom of 800 square feet rents for $1,500. I mean, that's a little bit more affordable. But the purpose-built of today is going to be very expensive. But to suggest that we're going to sacrifice development charges and forego infrastructure projects that we need in order to get those, to reach those intensification targets that Councillor Munch speaks of,
Time.
we're going to have that infrastructure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, is there anyone else that wants to speak or has questions for the presenters here? We have gone 2 rounds, Councillor Munch.
If I can just please, there's a dialogue here for a forum. I think if people are giving commentary, we have to set the facts straight if we can, really.
Okay, well, I really have loosened the procedure here on the debate on this motion.
Well, people didn't talk first round. They came on a second round to have this discussion. Surely there should be, if they're going to talk about the second round, to go on a first round, and they didn't go on a first round, then surely there should be some discussion, especially when there are comments made that are contrary to provincial and regional direction. And if we don't want to follow provincial and regional direction here because we have a concept, we can do that. But this is a forum. Our staff need to know this.
Well, we're having a productive discussion here for councillors to be informed of what's going on. I guess it's I can put it out to councillors. Someone want to move the unusual or allow for an unusual 3rd round for Councillor Munch. Deputy Mayor Pirelli.
Happy to do that, Mr. Chairman. I think Councillor Munch is right. We have this opportunity. He clearly feels that there's some disconnect. I'm interested in hearing it. I'm happy to have that discussion with him. I think he was referring to me. By the way, Councillor Munch, I did speak on the first round. I was the first speaker. So
okay,
I spoke on the second round, and I'm happy.
We're willing to move to suspend with our normal process.
Right.
Is there a seconder for that? Let's do it democratically, because I want to just follow rules. We have a procedure and a practice. Councillor Liu is going to second that. Okay. All in favor of just allowing a 3rd round here? I see lots of hands and a request to speak, so I note one objection, but including myself, that's 5 members. I see 2 that don't want to, but including myself, that's 5 members. So go ahead, Councillor Munch, and we're going to have an abbreviated
Do I get to speak to the motion?
Well, yeah,
Well, my sign's been up the whole time. You just chose to ignore it, I assume.
motion on the floor.
Clearly not a vote. These are voting cards. This
Yeah.
is, I'd like to speak to the motion.
Councillor Barros, you're within your right.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the motion in front of us, is this just to allow Councillor Munch to have a third round?
No,
Is-
it's a vote to have a third round. Moved by Mayor Pirelli, seconded by Councillor Liu, to go to a third round.
Okay, I can vote in favor of a third round, yes.
Okay. Anyone else want to discuss that? Okay, all in favor of doing that? It's a green card for me, so that's 5. Okay. Councillor Munch, we're going to make it 3 minutes per
Fair
speaker.
enough. I'll be last. So on December the 2nd, we have a report. On February the 24th, we had a report in front of council. We have a provincial who have made overtures. We have a region who has passed affordability. I don't know if other members of council know this, or the region has passed. We are in a housing affordability crisis. Our staff have moved forward to say on that. We have on March 24th of this month to talk about how we are going to move density into existing neighborhoods. Why is that important for this conversation? If people do secondary suites and third suites in existing areas right now, are there DCs going to be collected for that?
Mr. Treasurer, that's a good question. I think it needs to be answered there.
To you, Mr. Mayor, we don't collect DCs for secondary suites.
So my real concern here is we are increasing density inside neighborhoods, not collecting DCs, which is going to have a substantial, and yet if people are going to use more people in a household in existing neighborhoods, and we have more water consumption, which is going into our sewer system and is putting more costs for garbage, what have you, for our own community, higher costs for our municipality, lower DCs. We are growing at a declining rate. This is fact. We are becoming the mature end of our life cycle, and our management of our finances are important. And these DCs, if we keep raising costs of DCs in proportion to our neighboring municipalities, those costs get passed on. People don't absorb higher costs and absorb losses, or they choose to go elsewhere. And I think maybe we should have a forum there. And I asked that in my earlier meeting. We should really have a forum as per people who have built here and ask them to come forward and show us their performers, what have you. And when we hear people talking about a 1% return for 20 years, there's not a lot of people that would say, please put your money out there to get a 1% rate of return. And so if we're asking for housing affordability, we have people wanting to step up. Governments at the region, governments at the province, and the federal government have provided dollars in the last 2 months to areas to provide supply of housing. And we as a local government have to realize that we have to work in cooperation with those other government policies. Otherwise, we're on the outside. So governments are trying to, at the regional level, at the provincial level, and at the federal level, have made overtures. And we are not working along those same contexts that they are. And that concerns me. But again, whatever council wants to do, and I'm not saying what my opinion is. I'm just giving you what the region, what the province, what the federal government are doing. I say to ladies and gentlemen, when you go talk to the previous finance person, Mr. Hughes, who's a consultant, and you ask him, what's the status of our situation in the region, how we're growing, and you heard last week at the region, for those that were luxurious enough to be able to listen, those that attended, fantastic. I'm surprised Mr. Chan, I'm not sure where he is today, our regional representative, but this is important. So I'm looking forward to the consultation. I thank you for the report. Mr. Scanlon, again, thank you so much for the information. Mr. Dexter, good feedback, but we really, really please need to we really raise our game here, ladies and gentlemen, because we're not getting, young families are not coming to Richmond Hill. Seniors are not able to having the affordability. We're not having the job creation, and we are the second least affordable municipality in Ontario. That really worries me. And people are going into rentals because they can't afford down payments and there's not enough housing supply. Those are not my positions. Those are positions that are widely acknowledged and in reports at the region. They've been announced by provincially, and it's many people are talking. Even the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing admits we're in that crisis mode. This is not an opinion about if I'm a landlord or not a landlord, but ladies and gentlemen, we need to talk about it. Really, please. So,
Thanks,
thank you.
Councillor. Thank you. I think that's 3 minutes. Okay, Councillor Barrows.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can I just get the clarification on what it was we went to the third round for? Deputy Mayor Pirelli said something that Councillor Munch said was in contravention or didn't agree with the region, but I didn't really grasp what it was that Deputy Mayor Pirelli said that Councillor Munch said was wrong.
I think Councillor Munch just clearly had some more to say on the topic, and we voted and we
So
allowed him to do that.
It wasn't about what Deputy Mayor Pirelli said. It was just another opportunity to speak.
I didn't hear anything specifically targeting another member of council. He has some general comments about housing affordability.
We go back to the tape. I'm sure we'll hear differently, but that's your ruling. I respect that. Thank you.
It's not a ruling. Ask me a question. Deputy Mayor Pirelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, in fact, I voted to go to a third round because Councillor Munch did say that I made statements that were contrary to regional and or provincial and federal statements. I was hoping to hear what those may have been, but I didn't hear that, and that's okay. I respect the fact that he doesn't want to speak about them now. Just to touch on what Councillor Munch said about people can't afford a down payment. I don't believe that the study distinguished between those who can't afford versus those who don't want to afford and those who don't, who have made other life choices to go in a different direction. I think it's important that we recognize that a lot of this is by choice and not by being forced, because we are masters of our destiny, and we choose what path we take. Some, and I believe, is my opinion, that very few is a result of natural forces as opposed to choices, because we all do make choices how to spend our money and the sacrifices we make. I'll give an example, Mr. Chairman. Being of European descent, we know that when our forefathers came here, they came with nothing. And they made certain sacrifices in order to get a better life for their families. And that meant making the sacrifices. And today I feel that a lot of people aren't prepared to make those same and similar type of sacrifices. Why is it that our children can't live at home with us and save money while they're going out to work? We've now, as a result of the pandemic, we've seen a return because a lot of people have lost their jobs and had no choice but to come back home to live with the family.
1 minute.
Thank you. But pre-pandemic, it was important to ask the question, why is it that some, even our children, choose to set out in the world? And we all want a better life, of course, but why are we rushing to pay $2,100 for a one-bedroom apartment alone in a job that barely affords to make those payments using 50, 60, 70% of your income, when they could have stayed at home? Because I know my kids have the option of staying at home. They had a bedroom, they can still have a bedroom and they can stay there. So I think we really need to examine what it is that gets us to that point. And I think a lot of it has to do with choice. And we live in a free society and people are free to make those choices. Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Thank you, Deputy Mayor Pirelli. So, Council, this I don't see any other speakers. This is a workshop. Definitely was giving a lot more latitude than our normal process and procedure. We only have the one presentation and the one motion on the floor now to receive. I've had lots of good discussion around that. I think, well, I'm gonna leave my comments to what I've said before. These are all contributing factors to housing costs. That's something we gotta consider. I'm gonna call the vote now. Motion by Councillor Munt, seconded by Councillor West. All in favor? You got your green cards? I don't have mine. I raised my hand here. I see it's unanimous from the 6 people I can see. I can't see 2 others, but that carries, Mr. Clerk, with at least 6 votes in favor. I appreciate council's time, and I look forward to working together with you, Mr. Scanlon and Mr. Dexter next month when you come forward with a more formalized draft for us to look at. So I just need a motion to move confirm the proceedings of this meeting. Deputy Mayor Pirelli, Councillor Liu, thank you. Are there any discussion before we call the vote? All in favor? Okay, that appears to carry unanimously. Thanks very much.
Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn, Councillor West, Councillor Deputy Mayor Pirelli. All in favor? Any opposed? Again, I believe that's unanimous.